আফজল হোসেন, প্রফেসর আফজল হোসেন। এখন আমি মোশাররফ হোসেন খান, ডিপার্টমেন্ট অফ ইংলিশ, স্কুল অফ ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং, প্রেসিডেন্সি ইউনিভার্সিটি, তাকে একটু পেপার তৈরি করতে বলছি।
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Abu Saleh, Dr. Abdul Mateen, Dr. Riaz, and others, of course. I mean, I'm not mentioning everyone. And it has been a privilege to come here and attend this first base conference. I mean, we always wanted something like this, but finally it has materialized. Thank you very much, organizers. I'll give a bit of background of what I'm going to do here. I'm going to speak, the title of my paper is Emergent Muslim Middle Class, Islam and the Construction of Muslim Identity in the Late 19th Century. Before I present, I'll just give a brief background. In 2017, we had edited, there's this online journal called Cafe de Census. We had edited an issue on Muslim life in West Bengal in that journal in 2017. I and my fellow editor Mursid Alam, together we edited it. And at the time we got only around 10 articles. And it was a very difficult job to even find these people to write on Muslim life in Bengal. And today I'm surprised that there are like some 35, 40, 50 presenters who are presenting on Muslim life in Bengal. This is a huge kind of progress in a couple of years, the way they're doing things here. So what we are doing at the moment, what I'm going to present, why I'm saying this is because what I'm going to present, this particular paper was actually written for that particular issue of Cafe de Census. And we are converting that issue, Mursid and I, now into a book. And honestly speaking, I have not done much research even after that. So this is pretty much a working paper, and I'm open to suggestions, comments, questions of every kind on this paper. And this is not a literature paper. I'm a literature scholar, but this is a paper on history about Muslim identity, emergence of Muslim middle class in the late 19th century. So I feel a bit like an interloper at the moment. I'm assuming the role of a historian, which I'm not supposed to do. I'm not a professional historian in that sense. I'm a literature guy. So because there's one component on the emergence of Muslim middle class in the contemporary time, I thought we can go back in history and look at how there was a similar sort of movement toward the end of the 19th century and what exactly happened at that moment and how the Muslim middle class emerged. But while I do that, there are three components in my paper. In the first component, I would also look at how a Hindu middle class emerges with the founding of Hindu College, which became Presidency College later on. And after that, I'll look at what Muslims were doing around the same time. When Hindus were trying to liberalize themselves in terms of Western education, Muslims were leading all these religious movements in Bengal, Faraizi movement, Wahhabi movement, and all these other movements. And then how toward the end of the 19th century, there came a moment when Muslims had this kind of, these educated Muslims had a kind of crisis of belief, whether we are Muslims or we are Bengalis, and how to resolve this kind of a crisis. So I'm going to talk about these three in very brief. Let me start with the 1871 census of the British government. This was the first census in which a policy was adopted that the number of people would be counted in terms of religious affiliation, what we call communal affiliation today. That was the first census in which it was done. And it was found when W.W. Hunter did it, he found that there was a lot of Muslims living in this eastern part of the country, in the supposedly lowland. And so he had to come up with some kind of a theory. How did this really happen? Why are so many Muslims in this part of the country, in Bengal that is? And one of the theories that was given is that most of these Muslims are converted from lower caste Hindus. But at the same time, it was found also that there were some Muslims who were claiming to be the Ashraf, the so-called upper caste, Urdu-speaking Muslims, but living in the urban centers like Calcutta and all these places. So Hunter then revised, and he said there are some Muslims who could be called upper caste or Ashraf, and others could be called as Atraf or Azlaf. So these two categories were based on ethnicity and linguistic diversity. That is, Urdu-speaking Muslims from Calcutta, and who are also claiming descent from Afghans and Arabs. And then you have the other lower caste, so-called supposed lower caste Ajlaf or Atraf Muslims. But the interesting thing is that there was never much of an interaction between these two segments of Muslims in this part of Bengal. They lived in two different sort of totally alienated spaces without much interaction at this very moment. Sorry, this is too slanting. The papers are slipping off, actually. So with the arrival of the British, what happened? There were a lot of these so-called upper caste Ashraf Muslims who were in the Mughal judicial services, administrative services, in trade, and there were landlords as well, whereas Atraf Muslims were mostly poorer peasants, which we find later on as well. And they were living into these two separate spaces. And before I go on to talk about how throughout the 19th century, the Muslim identity sort of congealed into a homogeneous kind of religious identity despite the differences, let me give a brief outline of Hindu middle class in the 19th century. What exactly is happening with the Hindu middle class at the same time. I think most of us do know about this part of the history, but still I'll repeat it. As I said, the basic difference between between Hindus and Muslims was, whereas for the Hindus there was an intermediary middle class between the upper caste and the lower caste, which was produced with the help of English mediation to a great extent, the British mediation. In the case of Muslims, it didn't really happen. The Ajlaf and the Ashraf lived in two different spheres altogether. There was hardly any interaction between the two. But in the case of Hindu middle class, we find this gradually, even before Macaulay's Minute in 1835, there is a gradual emergence of a middle class like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others who are the intermediary between the so-called upper caste and the lower caste, and it happened because of their proximity to the British. And over time, they felt that they needed some kind of media participation. By media participation, I don't mean like today's visual media we are talking about. That some educational institutes which could bridge the gap between the lower caste and the upper caste. And Hindu College was one such media participation organization, in the words of David Lerner. So Hindu College was founded in 1816, which is now Presidency University, of course. And it was founded by Calcutta elites with the aim of psychic mobility. I quote from Lerner, liberating a man from his native self to shape for himself a different personality than that which he was born with, unquote. Of course, we know what happened gradually. It gave rise to something what we call today the Babu class, the Bhadralok class, the elite, the gentle middle class Bengalis. And this process was serially helped also by missionaries like William Carey. Many of us might know about William Carey, the Srirampur missionary, who was driven away from Calcutta, in fact, because he was a Baptist. So other missionaries in Calcutta couldn't stand him. He had to go out of Calcutta. In Srirampur, he founded Srirampur College, and then he founded these printing presses where he, for the first time, started, in fact, the first Bengali periodical started in Srirampur, not in Calcutta, which is called Digdarshan. It was a magazine for the youth. And also, the first issue of Samachar Darpan, Mirror of the News, the earliest Bengali newspaper. These evangelical missionaries did one important thing. What they did, they made Bengal Renaissance from an elite activity of a few people like Ram Mohan Roy and others into a mass consumable phenomenon. Because they were transmitting this through this media, like their newspapers, their magazines, and it was reaching a larger number of people. Many people could read it, and that greatly helped. And around the same time, we find in 1823, Bhavani Charan Banerjee writing the first, what we call today, the social history of Bengalis. Kolikata Kamala Loy, the first social history, where a rural guy comes to Calcutta and talks to a Babu. It's satirical, it's funny, but he invented the term called Bhadralok, in fact, in this particular book, which he kept on writing about the Bhadralok in many other books. So what does it tell us really about the Bengali, Hindu Bengali middle class? That there is an emergence. There is also a cultural consciousness of being a Bengali, which is mediated by the printing presses, the kind of writing that's happening, being circulated. And these Hindu colleges, one of the graduates from this Hindu college, Bankim Chattopadhyay, in fact, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, was then started writing about what today we know as the Hindu nationalism. He was writing about cultural nationalism. So Hindu college did that. It brought about, this media brought about an opportunity for Bengali middle class Hindus to talk about their cultural history, their social history, but what was happening to Muslims around the same time. It's very interesting actually, if we look at it. So let me now talk briefly about what was happening to Muslims around the same time. Many of us know about the Faraizi movement, I'm sure here, Haji Shariatullah's Faraizi movement. It started in 1819, by the way. In 1816, Hindu College was founded, which was supposed to be the media for the emergence of a new middle-class Hindu, upper caste mostly, but still. Whereas Muslims were more busy with religious reform movements around the same time. In 1819, Haji Shariatullah started what we today know as Faraizi movement. So what we see throughout 19th century, almost from the beginning of 19th century, we have these 1930s onwards at least. We have these two different religious movements. The Wahhabis, the influence came from Delhi, Said Ahmad from Bareilly, where he started it. And then you have Faraizi movement starting in Bangladesh itself with Haji Shariatullah in Faridpur and all those areas. These movements, if we see, were basically religious reform movements, but in the case of Faraizi movement, it went beyond religion. It became a kind of socio-economic movement of the poorer peasants who were struggling against the landlords. And these landlords were mostly Hindu landlords, in some cases Muslim landlords as well, and British indigo planters. So religion and politics became kind of a mix, potent mix in this struggle against the Hindu upper caste landlords in most cases. So whereas the Hindus were struggling with liberating the self from its constriction of nativity, the Muslims were mostly focusing on Islam. They were focusing on religious reform of the Wahhabi and the Faraizi kind. And they were trying to struggle against, mostly poorer Muslims, they were struggling against the landlord and others. But interestingly, around the same time, we find that around 1817, those of us who know a little bit of Wahhabi history, we see that the Wahhabis in 1857, they'd taken part in first War of Independence. And as a result, the British cracked down on the Wahhabis around that time, and there were trials going on in Bengal and in other places. From 1863 to 1817, the Wahhabis were brutally suppressed. And with that, the Islamization of this kind, the reform of this kind came to an end almost in this part of Bengal. But it doesn't mean that Islamization had stopped. Islamization kept on happening even at this time. And interestingly, from these religious reformers, the Islamization had now moved on to more students from madrasas and the local mullahs. In fact, in eastern part of India, in eastern Bengal actually, in what we call today Bengal, local mullahs had started also Islamizing because they had faced a threat from these religious reformers of the Wahhabis and Faraizis, who for the first time said, we have to do away with all forms of accretion to Islam. We need to go back to a purer form of Islam. And the local mullahs, who were influenced, of course, by who believed in Pir and Murid and that kind of stuff, they had a crisis. And how to, assert their own authority among the rural populace. So they also took to the task of Islamization. They started giving these religious sermons. They had to clarify their stand sometimes. They had to rationalize to an extent why they're doing what they're doing. And later on we find madrasa-educated students also joining them. They're writing religious tracts to help these village mullahs to spread the message of Islam around the rural areas. But interestingly, this also led to a kind of pan-Indian identity. What I mean by that, I'll explain. It was not just restricted to the rural areas. When Islamization started, these Bengalis also started feeling that they're part of a much larger segment, which is not just Bengali Muslim. It was also they were part of something called Islam as a global, as a world religion, with its origin somewhere else. So it sort of transcended the rurality, the regionality, and it became a more pan-Indian kind of movement with this Islamization. Now, I just read out this part. The Islamization drive of the mullahs was aided by prosperous and educated Muslims, by the way. I mean, if we look at the kind of organization that's being built by base at this very moment, there's always, I know, this question, the red herring of Islam. We are Muslims, yet Islam is a distinct category, and what to do with it? How much can you co-opt rural Muslims? How much can you go beyond the so-called middle class kind of Muslim sensibility? And it's the same thing happening here. The Islamization drive of the mullahs was aided by prosperous and educated Muslims who saw in the rural Muslims a potential political ally in their fight against the Hindu elite. The well-organized anjumans, these religious bodies, and the growing madrasa-educated graduates ably assisted the process of Islamization through missionary work, by writing religious tracts and by addressing religious assemblies. They professionalized the process of Islamization, which was not the exclusive domain of the village mullah anymore. So we see a movement where, in the 19th century among Muslims, the interesting movement of Islamization, which starts with religious reformers like Farizis and Wahhabis, then moves to the village mullahs, and finally taken over by middle-class madrasa students, who are going now professionalizing the whole activity by writing books about Islam and all that kind of stuff. I come to my final point now, which is, what happened after that, after this process of Islamization? Because Islamization brought a larger consciousness of being Muslim. Now, the question at this moment was raised, were the Muslims in Bengal Muslims for religious identity? Would the new call for Westernization be inconsistent with Islamization? Now, let me explain what I mean by Westernization. Around the same time, especially after the First War of Independence, Sipahi Mutiny in 1857, the British were on very unsteady ground because they were scared of Muslims at this moment because of the large Muslim participation in the Sipahi Mutiny, if you see. So they wanted to find, especially they were scared of Wahhabis, whom they cracked down on from 63 to 70. They demolished them almost completely. But it also sort of led them to introspect. Why are the Muslims so disaffected with the British rule? So just like Sachar Committee today, there was a Hunter Commission. Interesting parallel, that Hunter Commission was supposed to find out what's wrong with Muslims. Why are they lagging behind exactly? Why are they taking part in this kind of seditious activity? And the Hunter Commission found that there must be an English-educated intermediary between the Bengali Muslims and the British, who can do two things. One, they can contain the seditious tendencies of poorer Muslims to an extent. And second, they can also act as a counterbalance to Hindu elite, upper caste elite, who were very nationalist, who were taking part in the nationalist movement at the time. So to contain them, a middle-class Muslim had to be developed somehow. And the Hunter Commission reported on it, that this is how to do it, by giving them English education. We haven't forgotten, of course, Aligarh movement. I'm not talking about it, but if you see a parallel, the same thing happened in Bengal. If you see, look at people like Abdul Latif Khan Bahadur and then Maulana Keramat Ali, they were advocating for the cause of Western education. But at this very moment, interestingly in Bengal, there are two divisions. One group wanted to go for madrasa education, the other one wanted to go for Western education. So there was a kind of forking of this intent at this very moment. And I end my paper by saying that throughout the 19th century, how was the Muslim identity exactly formed, or what kind of churning was happening? I would say that the Muslim Bengali identity was constructed throughout 19th century, in fact, as a result of the antagonistic relation between the Ashraf and the Atrab in the beginning of the 19th century, as a contest between the rural traditionalist mullahs and jihadi reformist preachers throughout the 19th century, and also on the basis of a new alignment in interest among the urban educated and rural educated, semi-educated, illiterate Muslims on the basis of a religious solidarity. Now the point that we can take out with this, if we have to make a broad-based movement possible, then we already have a recipe over here from late 19th century. And that recipe would be that you have to make these larger alignments in movement, not just being restricted to so-called educated middle class, English educated liberal folks. We need to broaden it, the scope of the movement. the way they did it in the 19th century. Of course, now the question is that elite, that middle class which was created by the end of 19th and 20th century, we know much of it moved to Bangladesh. We are impoverished in that sense. But this is a second chance we are getting. Again, there's a movement. Again, there's an emergence of a new kind of middle class, right? So the history, it's a full cycle. It comes back, basically. And that's what we are trying to look at. Thank you very much.